Hello, one and all. Welcome to the next episode, the latest episode of Talk About Bupkes, the podcast of the Bupkes that you can get on thebupkes.com and wherever your ears go for podcasts. We have a fantastic, fascinating, insightful, lesser heard of and understood and known story from European history today that very much relates to issues going on today in European politics. And to tell us about that, coming all the way from Helsinki, is Oula Silvennoinen, who's going to correct me on the pronunciation of his name.
Yeah.
He is a university researcher at the University of Helsinki. His research and his work focuses on Holocaust studies, fascism, the history of the SS and the Nazis in Finland, which is what we're going to talk about today. Very interesting, and many things that relates to things going on in our world today. So, Ola, welcome to talk about Bupkes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Noah. And yeah, rather good pronunciation. I would say Oula Silvennoinen, but it's close enough.
Well, I defer to you again, as we were speaking about before we were recording. Noach is a mouthful. Many people mispronounce that as well. So I sympathize and I apologize but I will work on my Finnish.
We Eastern Europeans are used to that.
Yeah, it's still not okay though. I think we'll try to always endeavor to improve on pronunciations of people's name, and I will certainly consult with the Finnish friends of the Bupkes to improve the Finnish pronunciation. But let's get on because we have a lot to talk about in this episode. Again, a story that is little known outside of Finland, maybe even inside Finland, but something you're very familiar with, which is the dynamic between Finland, specifically its Jewish population, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union in World War II. And to not give away too much, we're going to get into the details. Not give away too much. I think it's the only or one of the only instances of Jews and Nazis fighting together against a common enemy. If I can sort of maybe be a little bit maybe reductionist, but that's sort of the big story, the big takeaway that is at the center of your research and your work. It's a fascinating story, and I'd love to get into it. So before we get into that collaboration, I guess you can say, maybe you can start with a bit of the prehistory.
Finland used to be part of the Swedish Empire, if it can be called such, ever since the medieval period, and remained hundreds of years as part of that realm until the early 19th century, when Russia conquered Finland as a part of the Napoleonic Wars, and Finland became a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire for another century. But what it did inherit from the Swedish period was the Swedish law, which forbade Jews to settle in the realm or practice their religion openly. So that the Jewish community in Finland only traces its history back to the mid 19th century, when the former Jewish soldiers of the Tsar were allowed to settle in Finland after completing their service, and that's the beginning of the Finnish Jewish community, which grew up to be something like 2,000 souls strong at the outbreak of the Second World War. Jews were granted citizenship rights in Finland in 1918 after Finland's independence, and for that reason, most of the Finnish Jews by the Second World War had citizenship rights, and that caused most of the weird things that happened during the war when Finland allied with Germany in 1941 to attack the Soviet Union. It also meant that the Finnish Jews were called up in service and ended up fighting alongside the Germans against the Soviet Union.
So just to understand, Jews in Finland, at least originally, have their rights to thank not to Finland but to Russia, because Finland was part of Russia at the time, and And as you say, soldiers coming back were allowed to settle there. They were allowed by Russian authorities, not by Finnish ones.
Yeah, very much so. That the Swedish law that Finland inherited from the 18th century was very restrictive in that regard, and the presence of the Jews was, or the Jews could thank the right to settle in Finland originally, to the Russian Tsars. That's true.
So this is an interesting sort of break here because would it be accurate to say that the Jews of Finland were thankful then to Russian authorities, while the Finnish state itself, or the non-Jewish majority, was of course very hostile to Russia? Was there any kind of split there in senses of loyalty or senses of fealty, senses of who kind of uh, could be relied on for protection?
I do think it's right to say that the Finnish Jews very much identified with later with Finland and its struggle for independence, and with the growing anti-Russian sentiment towards the early 20th century. And in that regard, they certainly wanted to be Finns first, and anything else second. Uh, but say there certainly was anti-Semitism in Finland too, and traditionally Jews had been regarded as second-class citizens, or somehow unreliable element in the society, and those sentiments certainly show through occasionally if you look at the Finnish press or contemporary publicity or stuff like that, or the fact that Finland was actually very late in granting citizenship rights to Jews.
So how does it compare to other European countries? This question of assimilation, question of citizenship, and other rights. Um, you know, we don't hear much about Finland. I mean, I think for obvious reasons, it's a small country. It is on the periphery of what is today considered sort of modern Europe or the European Union. Um, it has a very small Jewish population. Of course, itself is a small population overall. So can you tell us more about,
Mm.
how are things happening in Europe and more broadly, sort of ricocheting and feeding into what was happening in Finland?
Yeah, yes, Finland certainly was a latecomer to Jewish emancipation in that regard. That up until the independence of the country in 1917, 1918, uh, there were no possibilities of actually sort of rethinking the legislation in that regard, and it took a kind of extended struggle to push through the legislative bodies the idea that Jews also should enjoy citizenship rights. And Finland and Romania, I think, are the two last European countries to grant Jews citizenship. So in that regard, it certainly doesn't shine.
And so this brings us up to the eve of the Second World War. It seems obvious why Finland would have no love for the Soviet Union and might want to ally itself with any country opposing the Soviet Union, given Finland's own traumatic experience under occupation and being controlled by Soviet Russia. But still, tell us more about this relationship between Finland and Nazi Germany.
Mm.
What did it look like? What did it feel like? Was it an enthusiastic alliance? Was it just sort of a compromise? How is Nazi Germany viewed in Finland?
That's a broad question. I try to be compact. Uh, there certainly Germany had been an important European country, and a kind of cultural lodestone also for Finland, and if any foreign language was spoken in Finland, it was German before the Second World War, and German cultural influence was great in the country, and many people had very warm feelings towards Germany, uh, uh, inherited from the period of Imperial Germany, and the fact that in 1918, when Finland had fought its civil war, Imperial Germany had intervened, and many people saw the Germans as helpers, if not even saviors of the country in that regard. And part of those feelings also carried over towards how the Finns saw Hitler's Germany then. But it doesn't mean that in the interwar period Finland would have been in any way sort of close ally to or an admirer of Nazism. The major factor that brought Finland into the alliance with Germany was the Finnish-Soviet Winter War in 1939-1940, which was a direct result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in August 1939 by Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union, in which Finland was decreed to be part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And Stalin's government consequently demanded territorial concessions from Finland, which the Finns were reluctant to grant. And when the negotiations stalled, the Soviet troops attacked Finland in November 1939. And that was the major thing that turned the absolute majority of Finns against the Soviet Union, and also made it very easy later to ally with Hitler's Germany when the promise of winning back the territories lost in Winter War was dangled in front of the Finns. And even though there certainly were segments in the Finnish society who were more than enthusiastic about the thought of actually not just allying with Germany, but also with the Nazis, that can in no way be described as a general feeling among the Finns. But most Finns were ready to agree the alliance with Germany in the name of returning or overturning the verdict of the Winter War and winning back the territories lost in 1939, 1940.
So that puts Finland almost like in its own kind of Sonderweg, to use a very loaded word from German historical discourse. That's in a sense separating it from, let's say, the Polish experience, where Poland was also a victim of the Soviet Nazi machinations and agreements and dividing up of land. But you don't see Poland, allying with trying to find the least bad option, or the least bad, the devil instead of the devil you don't, and trying to win back its territories. What made Finland different from other experiences in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, that led not just to, why didn't Finland just declare neutrality?
Well, Finland, that certainly was an option, but the difference, of course, between Finland and Poland was that Polish statehood was extinguished as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the country occupied by both Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Nothing like that happened in Finland. Finland was able to retain the major part of the country and retain its independence, despite the Soviet original plan to occupy the entire country. But a Finnish military resistance was successful in that regard, that the Soviets had to abandon their original plan. In comparison to other East European states, we can say that every state that fell between the Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence suffered one way or the other, and everybody had their own Sonderweg. And in that regard, I don't think Finland is any different. But it's just that the fact that it was geographically peripheral also helped us to both maintain our independence and then later to make foreign political decisions of our own.
It's clear what it's quite clear what Finland would get out of this relationship with Nazi Germany, vis-a-vis confronting the Soviet Union. What was Nazi Germany's interest? Just having another ally, or what? What was it hoping? How did it view Finland?
Most certainly. Finland's border with the Soviet Union was something like 1,300 kilometers long, and that constituted a full third of the initial front of the Operation Barbarossa. So certainly a considerable and important geographical avenue of operation. Germany, first of all, it wanted to, secure the Finnish resources, most important of which were the nickel mines in the very north of the country, and then, of course, secure Finnish military assistance in operations against mostly Leningrad. And the Finns themselves wanted, first of all, to get back everything they had lost in the Winter War, and many in Finland thought that at the same time Finland should take a bit more and add those areas of the Soviet Union which were inhabited by people speaking Finnic languages. They could easily be annexed into the realm.
Okay, so like in many cases, it comes down to very realistic ideas of resources and power projection, and part of a grander military strategy as Germany went in pushed into Soviet Russia
Certainly,
in
yeah, that had been
1940,
German
Barbarossa.
idea also already during the First World War, that the region and the area of Finland had been contemplated as a possible base of operations against St. Petersburg, and the kind of that kind of situation repeated itself.
So now we're moving into the Jewish population of Finland as until recently, or only a few years before receiving citizenship, being seen as equals, seen as members of society. What was Finland's contribution or requirement in fighting?
In fighting the war, you mean?
In fighting the war, right?
Uh,
Like
you
what
mean
were they expected to contribute? First, I mean, first, am I correct to assume that Jews were part of the Finnish resistance against the Soviet against in the Winter War?
certainly, yeah, yeah. I
Right.
mean, uh, those Finnish Jews who were also citizens, as most of them, absolutely overwhelming majority of them were like any other citizen expected to take up arms if they were male, and and also many of the Finnish Jewish women served in the women's auxiliary forces during the war. So they had the exact same duties as any other citizen.
And what does the historical record tell us about the idea of fighting alongside Nazi Germany? How did this work? I mean, this is a unique or fascinating aspect or side story of the Second World War and the Holocaust.
It is certainly, yeah, because many of the Finnish Jewish families had ties to outside of Finland, and were very well aware of Hitler's policies against Jews in Germany and later elsewhere in occupied Eastern Europe. And it certainly was not an easy question. I do think the major line, however, that the Finnish Jews adopted was to think that we're fighting for Finland as Finns, and we're fighting against Stalin. We're fighting not for Hitler, but against Stalin. And that was the kind of intellectual coping mechanism most of them resorted to in one form or another. Uh, After the war, of course, the situation became maybe even more difficult when they had to sometimes face the accusations from the international Jewish community that how could you do this? How could you fight for Hitler? And even then the answer most of them resorted to was just this, that we fought for Finland's security and independence and against Stalin, and not for Hitler.
And paint us a picture. What did that fighting look like? What did it look like? Jews and Germans, Nazis, fighting together against the Soviets. How did that actually? How was that actually experienced?
Yeah. The entire northern half of Finland had been at the outset agreed to form a German-controlled theater of war, where most of the troops doing the fighting were Germans. They had some Finnish troops under them, but that area was basically where you had the largest concentrations of German soldiers. You would find Germans from major towns in Finland, in port cities, and occasionally at the front in the southern part of the front as well. But most of the fighting there and most of the Jewish soldiers were there fighting alongside other Finns. But you would end up in occasional contact with German soldiers, sometimes even fighting alongside them. Uh, from what can be gained from the sources and later reminiscences, it never was an easy relationship, and there are a lot of stories about German decorations being handed over to Jewish soldiers, either by unwitting Germans who don't realize that they are dealing with Jews, or the Finnish Jews then refusing to take on German decorations, being rather well in the know of what the Germans are doing elsewhere. But say the general behavior of Germans in Finland remained much more civil than in the occupied territories, and in Finland the Germans did not behave like occupiers or an occupying force in general, and they were very much told by their superiors that no bad behavior will be tolerated because we're here as friends and allies, and not as occupiers, and that certainly also had an impact in the way they behaved elsewhere in Finland.
So to understand, so there wasn't that much contact. You had sort of a German zone of control and a Finnish zone of control, and there wasn't so much mixing, but it did happen on occasion.
Exactly.
Um, so what does that tell us about, Nazi ideas about race and purity and who the Übermensch and the Untermensch is? Like, it's just fascinating to me that they would tolerate this, right?
They
Like,
would, but
why Finland's the exception?
I think they were in general they were much more flexible, because they understood. Else, everywhere in Eastern Europe, they had to fight along people and rely on the help of people who they, in the strictest racial sense, considered as Untermenschen.
Like
But say,
Slavs, for
like
example.
Slavs, for example, or the peoples on the Balkans, or you name it. So everywhere they ran into this reality that even though, yeah, certainly after the war maybe things may be different, but for now we need to just uh, muddle on and behave, because we need these people.
Was there any awareness or thinking that from a German perspective, when we win the war, then we'll get rid of the Jews in Finland? Like, was there that idea? And did the were Jewish soldiers in Finland aware of this?
I think they were not directly aware, because nothing like this was ever voiced. But say a helpful document to understand the German thinking in this regard is the Wannsee Protocol from early 1942, in which the Germans listed very meticulously, actually, the Jewish populations also in the Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And they had done their homework clearly before the war, because they came down with very accurate figures. They listed the size of the Finnish Jewish population as 2,300, which is very accurate if you count both the Finnish Jews and those Jews who were non-Finnish refugees in Finland, but residing there during the war. Uh, and the implication clearly, if you read the protocol, is that for the time being, we're not doing anything, because in all these countries, some kind of difficulties can be expected if we uh, try to move on too quickly. And in any case, we have our hands full with the destruction of the Jews of Central Europe. So these people can be for the time being left in peace. But I guess the absolute unvoiced implication is that when we won the war, then we'll see what happens. And it is that's the saving grace of both Finland and the Finnish Jews, that it never came down to that there never was this moment when Germany would have decidedly demanded the overturning of Finnish Jews.
Are there instances of Finnish Jews being deported or being rounded up or experiencing anything that Jewish populations in other parts of Europe experienced, or were they truly sort of hands off?
The Finnish Jews, yes, they were hands
Yeah.
off. They were citizens of Finland, and any decision on them would have to reside with the Finnish authorities. And there was, of course, no reason to deport of your own citizens. The situation was very different for those Jews who were residing in Finland without the protection of citizenship, and especially for those Soviet Jews who had ended up in Finnish custody because they had been made prisoners of war by the Finnish troops. For as I learned in my own research when I was writing my PhD, the Germans certainly had a similar genocidal intent to handle the Jews also in the area they occupied in northern Finland, where they set up already in June 1941 a specific Einsatzkommando to to do precisely that what the Einsatz units of the SS did elsewhere in the occupied parts of the Soviet Union. And we do know from research that the Finnish authorities deported a total of 12 non-Finnish Jewish civilians into the hands of the Germans, 9 of which we know that perished as a result of that, and one of whom we know that he lived through the war. And then there are a few cases that are unresolved. And then on top of that, the Finnish authorities funneled from the Finnish-controlled prisoner of war camps several hundred of Soviet prisoners of war into the hands of the Einsatzkommando in northern Finland. And that number included also a disproportionate amount of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war. So that's the rough picture, basically.
Hmm. Are there any comparable examples? Is this I'm thinking, for example, Hungary. Hungary was a
Mm.
nominal ally of Nazi Germany, had a large Jewish population. I think the historical record is mixed on the extent to which the Hungarian government was able to or even wanted to protect its Jews. Um, Deportations from Hungary didn't happen until quite late. I don't know if that's an accurate parallel, but I'm
Mm.
Hungary. As you're talking to me, I'm thinking about Hungary. Is there
It,
anything that Finland kind of sizes up with elsewhere at this time period?
yeah, I think the story is a bit different everywhere outside German direct control. So each of the countries had a different relationship with to the Jewish populations and different history with anti-Semitism and different intentions in regard to dealing with their Jews, so that you can find an exception after exception after exception when you start to look on or uh, through the wide number of German allies, starting from Italy and Hungary, where certainly the anti-Semitism of the Horthy regime is not even to be discussed. But the fact remains that the deportation of Hungarian Jews truly did take place only after the German occupation of the country. Then there are places like Bulgaria, which after the war very much tried to create or uphold a story of the Bulgarian wartime government as a protector of Jews. When we start to look at it more clearly, we see that well, there certainly was no lack of anti-Semitism, but the fact also is that that most of the Bulgarian Jews were saved from the Holocaust. Not because the government would have actually made that a priority, but because more like some true quirks of history. And that's the similar kind of story repeats itself. So Finland is just another case in which the story played out a bit differently because of local circumstances.
And those circumstances led again to Jewish Finnish citizens fighting in some cases side by side, or at least for Nazi Germany. I mean, I think I've read and you can is it true? I mean, I've read some news articles that there are even some isolated incidents of SS officers sitting in synagogues with Jews, marking Jewish holidays, occasions. Is that true? These anecdotes that I've read, or is that a little bit sort of
Yeah.
mythologizing the history?
They may be, but it's very difficult to say with anecdotes because they tend to be just like that, and some of them are clearly drawn up after the fact and after the war.
Hmm.
So it's very difficult to say where the truth is, but it's certainly entirely possible. There are documentation of, for example, Jewish soldiers having their own field synagogue at the front, which was a marvel of passing Germans that this is basically an Axis allied army in which the Jews are having their own synagogue, and that's not certainly common, but
Interesting. Yeah, it's
mm,
the unique Finnish case, as you say. Every country kind of had to figure out things on their own, and there are quirks in every system. But the Finnish case is so interesting. So, as you said, you know, Jews in various countries weren't saved necessarily because the governments really cared about their Jewish populations. So, in that regard, what did anti-Semitism look like in Finland? What was the Jewish uh, participation in society? Were they religious? Were they secular? Yeah, paint us a
yeah,
picture of anti-Semitism at that time.
yeah. The Finnish Jewish community tended to be very urban. It was mostly concentrated on the three largest cities in southern Finland of the time, each of which had a synagogue before the war. But apart from that, there were wide areas in Finland where the population had never seen a Jew. But I'd say that the Finnish Jewish community before the war, it was almost exclusively Swedish speaking. It tended to vote for the parties of the right or the center right politically. Even though there were also socialists, but the mainstream certainly didn't vote for the left. And in that regard, I guess it was rather urban and secular community, which at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War had spent already decades being assimilated, and and a community which also desperately wanted to be regarded as first class citizens, and for that reason the war experience for them by no means was an entirely negative one, because you could show then that we too have fought for this country's liberty. We too have shed our blood, and the among the community there it tended to be a prideful thing that you had fought and showed that you also belong. Some of them said as much that that I'm a Finn first and a Jew second. Um, yeah,
Yeah, which is a phenomenon we've seen also in Germany, of course, where many German Jews saw themselves as German first. It was only the Nazis telling them that they weren't, that they are Jews, that they had to confront that sort of duality. The the
exactly.
Swedish the Swedish speaking, did that make them a double other, that they were both Jews and mainly Swedish speaking? Did that play any role?
Not so much as you might think, because the position of the Swedish language, especially in the southern towns, was still very, very strong before the war. Helsinki tended to be pretty much bilingual city in which Swedish and Finnish were spoken side by side, and that certainly didn't make the majority population to see the Jews as anyway strange. But when you came to, for example, um, specialized authorities like the security police, you could see that the kind of uh, anti-Semitism common elsewhere in Europe had certainly taken root of them, so that it even influenced the way they or their tactics and their thinking of who is in need of special surveillance. And you can find documents from among the security police authorities which clearly state that the Jews are not to be trusted, and the Jews are more likely to be communists as well, which also partially explains the treatment of the Soviet Jewish prisoners of war during wartime, because the idea that the Jews are somehow behind the Soviet system had clearly made inroads into the minds of these Finns who were working on very specialized fields of security and intelligence.
Right. And this is where you seep into anti-Semitic tropes about global domination and takeover and these kinds of things.
Precisely. I've looked at all the cases of which some sources remain of those Jews the Finnish authorities handed over to the Einsatzkommando in Finnish Lapland. And there are a few cases actually in which there is sufficient documentation that you can say anything about the motivation. But in all those cases, the motivation from the side of the Finns seems to be that because this person is, well, maybe a known communist activist or a known communist functionary and also a Jew, then he's kind of doubly suspicious and will get rid of him. And that's what they
So
did.
as in other places in Europe, it wasn't because the Finnish government was particularly fond of its Jews that they
No.
were saved.
Yeah.
They were just citizens and had these obligations. The and remind us again what the form of government at this time in Finland.
Finland was formed a republic in 1919 and remained so throughout the wartime, even though it might be said that the power of the parliament to actually the direct policy was severely curtailed during the crisis years. But officially Finland was a republic and as the saying goes, the only democracy to fight for Hitler.
So that's a second sort of uniqueness, one that Finnish Jews fought with Nazis, and also that a democracy fought with a fascist state, unlike Italy, Hungary,
Yeah.
Germany's other allies at the time, Austria, of course. Um, yeah, I mean that's I'm trying to wrap my head around that. I mean, I think it
Mm,
speaks. I think it has something to say today about this question of this reductionist political idea of democracy versus autocracy. Democracies don't fight each other, they work with each other.
mm.
But of course, there's always interests on the ground, particularities on the ground that might lead countries to make different decisions, even if they are nominally democracies.
Indeed,
Um,
but in Finland's case, it's quite clear that it was the experience of the Winter War against the Soviet Union that turned the public opinion so heavily against Stalin and his regime that it was easy to bring Finland into a renewed war, even alongside Nazi Germany, of which most Finns probably didn't care too much.
right. And so this brings us to sort of so of course Germany loses. Bring us to now after the war, both from the bigger picture of Finland and also the Jewish community. As you said, many Finnish Jews felt proud to have fought and to have contributed and sacrificed. That must have been and must still to this day be a really difficult cognitive dissonance when, of course, it came to light what many people already knew about the devastation to the Jewish community in Europe.
Indeed, yeah. Those years were difficult for everybody in Finland and probably doubly so for the members of the Jewish community. Finland was forced to sign an armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944, and then actually spent a few months fighting the retreating German troops as they made their way from northern Finland to back to Norway. But almost overnight, the political circumstances in Finland were changed so that the uh, after the armistice, a so-called Allied Control Commission that was dominated by the Soviets came to Finland to oversee the terms of the armistice, and Finland had to sort of adopt a totally new line of political orientation, which included friendship and trustful relations with the Soviet Union that just for 4 weeks before had been the mortal enemy. And that was a kind of somersault for many in Finland that was almost impossible to come to grips with. As a sign of the rapidly moving circumstances, the commander-in-chief of the Finnish armed forces, the Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, made his move in December 1944 and officially paid a visit to the Helsinki synagogue, because he had understood that in the new circumstances, it's certainly wise to give out the picture that he's been, well, the protector of the Finnish Jews all along. And that was a remarkably successful propaganda event. Both the Jewish community was happy to have him, and he was happy to be there, and photos were taken, and everything seemed great. But if you look at the wartime behavior of Finnish government, it doesn't seem that the Jewish question really played much role in their thinking. Finland had no legislation regarding the Jews especially, which of course is a good thing, because most of such special legislations were very restrictive or oppressive elsewhere in Europe. But the government doesn't seem to have discussed the treatment of Jews or their plight elsewhere in Europe until very late in the war, when it was already clear how the war is going to end, and that's only when it sort of became a matter of policy. It's also a telling incident that during the best days of the German-Finnish alliance, when it still seemed that the German is going to win the war, for example, Jewish citizenships where all of them were stalled in the Ministry of the Interior, and they were not sort of, if you applied for citizenship, the matter didn't proceed anywhere before 1943, when the government was changed, and most in Finland understood that Germany will not win.
And what did Finland get lucky that, as opposed to some of its other neighbors in the Eastern European region, that it was able to maintain its independence? I could see a different history happening where the Soviet Union occupies Finland and Finland becomes what the Baltic states are, or became.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, Finland was lucky in the sense that it was a geographical periphery in regard to the aftermath or the end game of the Second World War. The Soviets directed a major offensive against Finland in June 1944 in connection to the offensive in Belarus, and for a few weeks it seemed that the front might collapse and the Soviets might actually occupy Finland. But then, in successful defensive battles in which Finland also received considerable military aid from Germany, the Soviets were repulsed, and they never regained or they never repeated the attempt to sort of occupy Finland militarily and directed their energies towards the race of Berlin. And so Finland was saved from occupation and was able to retain its independence also after the war, which was a major issue. But after the war also, you could see that because of the proximity to the Soviet Union, Finland was forced to remain outside any Western security architecture, and had to decline Marshall aid, for example, and had to continue living in a kind of limbo, being basically a democracy and a market economy, very close to the Soviets, and with the Soviets having a considerable say in Finnish domestic politics.
So, what is this special situation of Finland and what happened to its Jewish population? How is that seen now through the memory of through the eyes of memory politics? How do people see anti-Semitism in Finland? What has become of the Jewish community after the war and its relationship with other Jewish communities?
Hmm. I do think that by now the kind of uh, things that arose immediately after the war, when there was a heavy internal discussion within the international Jewish community of who did what during and after the war. I think that's probably history by now, and the survival of the Finnish Jewish community is probably seen as a particular kind of success story. Uh, as is the survival of maybe entire Finland, who in the end turned out to be successful in navigating itself from the shadow of the Soviet Union into the European Union and the NATO finally, and that is also some kind of a tribute to the ability to kind of accommodate to the circumstances, but not so much that you totally lose your identity.
So when we think about anti-Semitism and the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and we think about certain political developments today, Finland does not really weigh into that debate so much. We think about Germany, France, Italy, bigger European countries. What does the Finnish experience have to contribute to sort of the larger European story?
I think if you ask a normal ordinary Finn nowadays, they don't think that Finland has ever had anti-Semitism. They think that for somehow this country is free of it, and that is not something that relates to us. The same goes with the history of the Holocaust. It's seen by the ordinary Finns. I would wager that it's seen as something that happened somewhere else to some other people to whom we have no relationship, and it's not part of Finland's history. All these things are also results of the post-war settlement and Finland's position as a kind of vulnerable uh, or its vulnerable position at the side of the Soviet Union, when certain things certainly couldn't anymore be openly discussed. And those things included Finland's relationship to Nazi Germany, Finland's relationship to the Holocaust, the history of the Finnish involvement in the Waffen-SS, for example, or the history of Finland's far right, which was quite numerous in the interwar period, but of which it was not wise to have very much public discussion after the war. Or if you did, it mean that you were probably a member of the political left or the communist, and you were trying to hurt the status quo in Finland. And that sort of created a lot of unvoiced things in the Finnish general memory of the war, of which the existence and the history of the Finnish Jewry is a part of.
And so to that point, talking about how, your average Finn might look back at things or might understand things. What about you? What interests you? What got you into this sort of research? Why are these issues important at all? What motivates your research about these
Yeah.
fascism, far right, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism? If it really is such a small aspect, and Finland's kind of on the periphery, as you say.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the question you asked, and I forgot to answer. Yeah, I think that to the general history of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and the history of the Jews, I think the Finnish case does contribute simply because it's again something quite different and forms an interesting point of comparison. I think the main strand in it is, how does a country that is basically a republic and a democracy and is governed by the principle of the rule of law, how does it navigate in a political situation which is dominated by two murderous dictatorships like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and you can learn a lot from that. I think I kind of stumbled upon these issues. I was originally supposed to write my PhD from a totally different topic, but then an opportunity arose to write it on the history of Finland's security police, which was something that I had always been interested in, but never thought I would do actual research upon. But when I started that work, I kind of, I stumbled into the fact that especially for this authority, the ties to Nazi Germany were way more deeper, way more programmatic than what I had expected. And then when it turned out that that the SS had maintained uh, a so far totally unknown Einsatzunit in Finnish Lapland, which had never been touched by any historian or actually many historians who had written about the German-Finnish military cooperation had said diametrically the opposite, that in their telling the Finnish northern Finland was something like a totally different place than the rest of the German Eastern Front. So when it turned out that it hadn't, that the exact same drive to enact a genocide and enact a political cleansing in the areas that would be occupied in the north was the idea, then I realized that I had hit something big, and I've been in many ways on that trail ever since. Or then I kind of also I stumbled to the fact that Finland did have a history with the Holocaust, and then it brought me to anti-Semitism, which I also started to look upon more closely and realized that Finnish anti-Semitism was very, very typical European interwar anti-Semitism. There's nothing particular about it, and it was much more widespread, and it's had much more influence than the Finns generally think still today. So I think those are my personal reasons to pursue these topics. There is much still to be uncovered, and I'm thrilled to be doing that. The
So, no, go on.
the general, let's say I was very struck by what I found in my PhD regarding the international research on the Holocaust, for example, that such a major thing could have gone for decades unnoticed by also international researchers, simply because most of the people did not have a good access to the sources because of the language and because much of the sources were here in Finland, and they had been closed for research until the 1980s. But it showed me that there certainly is a lot to be found if you just start digging, which is a good thing, or let's say an encouraging thought for any historian.
And not to pull you out of your role as historian, because I know historians and academics are always very careful that they're not political scientists, they're not politicians, they're not political commentators, and we would not want to put you into that awkward situation. But given the resurgence of far-right politics, given the resurgence of authoritarianism, earlier you said, Finland's clever way or efforts to try to position itself as a democracy between two totalitarian dictatorships. I think there are lessons here in the here and now to be looked at. How does this history and Finland's understanding of itself in the war, its understanding of anti-Semitism, its own anti-Semitism, how does that play into the larger European positioning now on these various relevant issues? Europe's position towards Israel and Israel's brutality against Palestinians and its other neighbors, all these sorts of things. Does that play a role?
Oh yes, certainly it does. I'd characterize Finland as a that we're still recovering from the experience, from the post-war experience, and as a consequence also from the wartime experience. But because these things could not be openly discussed during the immediate post-war decades when the Soviet Union was always a player in Finnish domestic politics, it has created a lot of silent pockets in the Finnish understanding of history, the Finnish understanding of this country's part in things, and this country's relationship to to well, things like the Holocaust, for example. It has tended to produce a kind of insular feeling in which the Finns think that the rest of the world doesn't belong to us. We have here our own little country, and everything is fine here, and just let's not just participate in, because it will mean only problems if we start to be internationally active. And that is a mindset that modern Finland has been struggling to get rid of, and we certainly have uh, now are now participating in international cooperation, also in regard to our own security, and have finally been able to take the step to join the NATO, which was something that the interwar Finns would absolutely overwhelmingly have voted for if they could have had such vote, and but which the post-war Finns were very wary of taking. Um, and we are at the same time, we're seeing that this country is slowly coming into line with, let's say, Western memory politics. And the Holocaust again is a very much a good pointer at that. The Nordic countries in general have been latecomers in kind of taking a critical look at their wartime histories, including occupied countries like Denmark and Norway, and then Sweden, and Finland has been the last of them to join. But we are now sort of in that process too. And to me, all that speaks of how important the kind of correct understanding of your own past, especially the past within living memory, is to the politics of today. For certainly, as in elsewhere, the history has in Finnish political discussion used to justify many things and many different policies, some of them totally opposite to each other. But that's why historians, especially, why not also political scientists, but historians especially do have a role in shaping politics or shaping policy through public discussion and public treatment, critical treatment, hopefully, of our own history, and by showing the connections, by showing the fact that Finland is not an island just like any other country, and it has certainly a relationship to the major issues of the day, has had it in history, and does so now.
You said that Finland is coming more into line with other Western understanding of memory politics, memory culture. What do you mean by that?
I've been involved with, especially with memory politics of the Holocaust, and memory political issues regarding Finland's relationship to Nazi Germany, and that's a field where you can see it very clearly. There is an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which Finland joined in 2010 as the last of the Nordic countries again, but still joined, and it is in that time that the teaching of the Holocaust was also made compulsory in the Finnish schools. Not before that. Before that, it was basically optional to the teachers if they would teach it or not. So that kind of shows you that things that formerly weren't thought of as so important or so crucial to Finland's own history are now being uh, uh, taken another kind of look, and are being reconsidered.
So in light of that, like you mentioned, the IHRA has come under incredible criticism for sort of instrumentalizing this memory culture in the support of Israel. Europe, to get European politicians and politics to back Israel almost, without exception. So has Finland also become then part of that? Does it shape Finland's politics? When you say about Finland becoming more involved internationally and not seeing itself as an island that it doesn't have to deal with any of these things, we see this very much in Germany, of course, for obvious reasons.
For yeah,
Is that also is that sort of mechanism and that phenomenon happening in Finland as well?
I'd say so. Yeah, we are becoming aware that we can't isolate ourselves from the great questions of our day and the crisis flashpoints of the world in that regard. There's a lively discussion right now in Finland whether Finland should recognize the Palestinian Authority as the Palestinian state. Uh, in line with the general trend of Finnish foreign politics ever since the Second World War, Finland has been very careful and very hesitant to do so, and still has not committed itself under the current government, and has not been terribly eager to follow the example of our Nordic partners, of which Sweden is historically and culturally a close one. But Finland has conspicuously during the post-war period been way more careful in its foreign policy than, for example, Sweden, who often has not refrained from criticizing foreign governments. There was a reason for that, and the reason again for decades was the Soviet Union and the reactions of the Soviet government and so. But now again, you can't anymore use that excuse. Also, Finland's relationship to Russia has been in great flux ever since the 2022, and that has brought great changes in how Finland sees its position in the world, especially in regard to Russia. And it's been only now that the spell has been broken and Finland has openly sided with the Western countries and the NATO countries.
And is Finland's hesitance, for example, whether it's condemning Israel or whether it's recognizing the Palestinian state or taking other actions that are less bold than some of its neighbors, is that a result of its history or specifically its understanding of its connection to Nazi Germany, or is that more of a realpolitik, especially now with the politics in the United States? You see kind of a lot of fear to do anything against the US because for fear of any kind of punishment that might come their way. Is it one or the other? Is it both?
I say
How
it's
do you see it?
both. There's this tradition of being very, very careful so that you don't uh, end up hurting the feelings of the major powers. But say part of that is also due to the current circumstances in Finnish politics. The government includes the Finnish far right party, the Finns party, and also the Christian Democratic Coalition, which is basically a Christian nationalist outfit that will do anything and everything as not to criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form, and they will. I do not think that any kind of decisive steps regarding, for example, the recognition of Palestine will be taken as long as this government is in power. But they are clearly struggling with it. That you can see.
And especially as the pressure is building it with some of European partners. Um, I think maybe where we end is the most recent events, which is this, and I think our conversation today illuminates that this news that sort of, as you say, Finland doesn't make the news very often outside of Finland, but this news of of Finland getting rid of its swastikas, or its Air Force getting rid of its swastikas
Mm.
made a bit of international news. What's going on with that? What is that? Tell us more about that, especially now that we've just talked about Finland's alliance and association with Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
I think this might also be a surprise to many of our non-Finnish listeners.
Right. Yeah. The first aeroplane for the nascent Finnish Air Force was donated by Count Erik von Rosen, a Swedish count, in 1918 during the Finnish Civil War. And von Rosen used the swastika as his personal emblem, and for that reason, also the plane he donated was had carried the swastika, which as a symbol at that time still, of course, wasn't tainted with Nazism, but it was a kind of a general marker of a nationalist mindset, even though I think there's good reason to describe Erich von Rosen later as at least a sympathizer of National Socialism. But that's another story. Anyway, for that reason, the Air Force, as it was constituted in the 1920s, it adopted the swastika as its emblem and used that throughout the war years and throughout the post-war decades, and actually was very resistant to occasional calls that maybe we should get rid of this symbol because people tend to interpret it the wrong way. And the most recent developments probably have most to do with Finland's NATO partnership and Finland's NATO membership, which has meant increasing contacts also with the Finnish Air Force to the NATO partners. And I do believe that it's been the experience of many Air Force officers that you need to explain this thing way too often, and it's misunderstood too often. There was also a recent book published by my colleague who kind of took down the history of the swastika in Finland, which has gained quite a lot of publicity. And it seems that a combination of these factors have finally made the Air Force leadership and the leadership of the armed forces to take the step to get rid of the swastika so that no one gets any wrong impressions.
So as usual, Germany is ruining it for the rest of us. We can't have
Yeah,
a nice
you could
symbol
say
anymore.
so. Yeah, yeah. The swastika tended to be rather popular emblem in Finland in the interwar years. It appeared every now and then everywhere, and it was even used in some of Finnish decorations. Some of Finnish, if you look at modern Finnish decorations, they still carry a stylized swastika. It's not easy to spot, but it's there. And I don't think they will change the decorations, but they certainly already in a few decades ago made the swastika sort of less visible in them, and now it's been taken down from the most visible position of all.
And this is really mostly an armed forces question. It's not like there are swastika flags in the streets of Helsinki.
No,
Uh,
no, no. The only ones who have tried to display them in the open have been Finnish neo-Nazis, and they were quickly taken away by the police.
and those swastikas have a very different meaning. Those are
Yeah, they were
the
Nazi swastikas and Nazi
these are
flags.
Nazi
Yes,
swastikas.
yes.
That is a very intentional thing. But as you said, with far right politics being what it is in Finland, has there been any pushback to try to? Has there been any kind of revisionism or effort to have a sort of revisionist history about the meaning of the swastika to keep it as a national symbol?
Yeah, certainly there's been a lot of discussion, but it seems that in this question, certainly the right has kind of lost its momentum, and it's lost the discussion. And anyway, the decision has now been taken. So the swastika with the armed forces is history. Otherwise, I'd say that with the far right in government, it means that also the rest of the far right has been relatively quiet, as if they would think that why make much noise now, then we have our guys there running things in a direction that we think is great. That might be the explanation.
And what is to end on a sort of a forward-looking note? What are you currently researching? What are you looking at? What sort of new things are you thinking about in the stuff you study?
I'm still writing the history of Finland and the Holocaust. That's certainly an ongoing work I do whenever I have time from other assignments. I'm studying the early history of fascism in the Nordic countries and fascism and fascist thought, and try to see where the possible influences come from and how they are transmitted through networks of people. That's one thing. And and then I'm also looking at parts of Finland's wartime in intelligence history.
Certainly, it's a history that I guess has no bottom
No,
of
no,
finding.
yeah, the good thing with history is that more gets done every day. So, but even so, even though I'd say that the war years are probably the most researched in Finland, but at least my personal experience has shown that you can still find so much new if you just dig.
Looking forward to what else you dig up in your research. Ola, thank you so much for this these insights into this very bizarre sort of corner of Holocaust history and its impact today. Very much appreciate your time for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.